My name is Elena Cruz. I'm 32, and last Friday, two envelopes landed on my kitchen counter that flipped my entire life upside down. One was an eviction notice, giving me 30 days to leave my home. The other declared I had just won $18 million in the lottery. That night, I didn't celebrate. Instead, I made a choice to use this moment as a way to see who in my family would stand with me if I had nothing. If you're watching, let me know where you're tuning in from. Now, here's how it all began. That Friday afternoon hit me harder than anything before. The first envelope slipped under my door looked ordinary, but the word printed in bold letters made the air leave my lungs. Eviction, 30 days to pack up and go. My apartment wasn't much, just a small one-bedroom with worn carpet and thin walls, but it had been mine. Seeing that notice felt like the ground breaking under me. I had been stretched thin plenty of times before, but this wasn't another overdue bill I could juggle. This was definite. My time was already decided for me. Still numb, I opened the second envelope, expecting another bill or some junk mail. Instead, the words blurred as I read them again and again, confirmation that the ticket in my purse had hit. $18 million. Two extremes in a single afternoon. The sharp finality of being thrown out, and the impossible weight of winning more money than I ever imagined. Before that moment, my life had been simple in its hardships. Long hours at the dental office, days of answering phones and filing claims, and a constant calculation playing in my head, each paycheck already spoken for. Rent, utilities, gas, and never enough left to feel safe. One missed shift or an unexpected bill could tip everything over. There was no one to lean on. The few times I had reached out to family for help, the silence that came after asking hurt more than the actual need. Holding that eviction notice in my hands made my body go cold. I thought about the half-crushed boxes I had been saving in the closet and about how quickly I might need to tape them back together. My worn sofa, dragged from one apartment to the next, flashed in my mind, and I wondered if it would end up abandoned on the curb. That was the kind of grief settling on me before I even registered the second envelope. But when I saw 18 million printed across that paper, confusion set in instead of joy. Shouldn't I have been shouting or grabbing my phone to announce it to the people closest to me? The reaction never came. My throat stayed tight. My smile never broke through. I just sat at the counter, staring at both pieces of paper, unable to process opposite realities pressed together in the same hour. Part of me felt the obvious relief. Debt and fear could be erased with a single signature at the lottery office. Yet another voice was louder, telling me to be cautious. I felt exposed, even though no one else knew. If word got out, everything could slip away before I'd even figured out what to do. So, before I let myself think further, I took one simple precaution. I tucked the ticket somewhere safe and reached out quietly to make sure the claim would remain private. At least that way, I knew the win wasn't going anywhere, even if I didn't tell a soul. That decision calmed me, but only for a moment. My thoughts went back to old memories. The last times I had asked my family for something smaller. Help when my car broke down, when I came up short on groceries, when rent demanded more than my paycheck had left. What always followed wasn't rescue, but the sound of excuses and advice I didn't ask for. Standing on my own had become the default, not because I wanted it, but because I had no choice. Those memories now stood in stark contrast to the fortune sitting folded up in front of me. So I didn't celebrate. What I felt instead was a strange clarity. The eviction notice could be more than a threat. It could serve as a kind of mirror. What if I said nothing about the win and let the eviction stand as the only story? Who would step forward for me then? Who would turn the other way? The idea settled inside me with surprising weight. The longer I stared at those two envelopes, the more deliberate the silence felt. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about questions I had carried for years without ever being able to answer. Did family loyalty exist when there was nothing to gain? Or had I been right all along to feel unsupported, even in smaller moments? Those questions had a chance, finally, to be tested. By the end of that night, I understood what really made the day extraordinary. It wasn't the fortune itself, but the timing, the collision of despair and wealth together. It handed me not only a way out, but also a way to uncover truths I had never dared face. I knew then I wouldn't touch the prize right away, not until I had my answers. Instead of rushing into celebration, I would choose a different path, one that would take me deeper into those family ties and show me things I wasn't sure I wanted to see. And that choice opened the door to something even harder. What happened next grew from a single question. If I pretended to have nothing, what would my family reveal about who they really were? That night, sleep didn't come. I lay awake, staring into the dark, while both envelopes stayed on the counter only a few feet from me. One threatened to strip me of everything I had built, and the other promised a future beyond anything I had ever pictured. In the silence, I knew I couldn't treat them as two separate events. They belonged together. Out of that thought, a plan formed with a clarity that surprised me. The choice was simple on the surface. I would keep the lottery win to myself. No hints, no celebrations, no sudden changes anyone could notice. Instead, I would let only one story out into the open, the one that looked like a dead end. I would tell my family about the eviction notice. Nothing more, nothing less. If I needed to test what kind of loyalty truly existed among them, this was the moment. All I had to do was play myself straight, a woman on the edge of losing her home. I decided to approach them one by one, repeating the same words as closely as I could each time. No bending the details, no extra emotion added for one person and not for another. Their answers had to be about them, not about how I presented it. That was the only way I'd know which responses were genuine. To make the test real, I needed something concrete to ask for. After hours of running numbers in my head, I landed at $1,500. It wasn't pocket money, but it wasn't unreachable either. That amount sat in the middle ground, large enough to force some sacrifice, but reasonable enough for an adult to manage if they cared enough. I didn't want them to give me comfort with words. I wanted to see if they would rearrange their own lives, even slightly, for mine. Behind this detail was a history I couldn't ignore. For years, I had been the one pitching in small sums whenever someone in the family fell short. My brother's groceries, my sister's kids' supplies, my mother's unpaid bill. None of it broke me individually, but together, those moments created a pattern I could feel in my bones. When someone needed, they looked to me, and when I asked in return, I was left with silence or surface-level concern. Carrying that pattern for so long had worn me down, but I had never had a way to step outside of it and put it to the test. Until now. What unsettled me wasn't the thought of hearing no. I had lived through that again and again. What unnerved me was thinking about what the results meant if every answer turned out to be rejection. That weight pressed on my chest as the clock edged past midnight. Would it only confirm something I had tried not to admit? And then there was the other possibility that one of them might agree, but not out of love. A gesture with strings, disguised as generosity, but meant to tighten control. Both outcomes carried a sting I wasn't sure how I'd hold. As these thoughts circled, I found myself digging through a drawer until I pulled out a cheap spiral notebook. On the first page, I wrote down each family member's name, one after the other. Next to them, I sketched out the answers I half expected. My mother, likely an apology, but no money. My father, a lecture on being responsible. My sister, something about her children's expenses. My brother, ducking away with humor or distraction. Writing it down calmed the chaos in my head. It was a way of setting up the rules in advance so I couldn't later rewrite what I had hoped for. The guilt came in waves right behind the logic, pretending to be broke when a fortune sat hidden in my home. It felt like a kind of betrayal. What if one of them reached deeper than I anticipated and helped despite their own struggles? Would I be the one causing the very pain I had hated feeling myself? Those questions scratched at me, but the longer I stared at my notebook, the clearer my answer became. This wasn't about harming anyone. It was about clarity. I couldn't keep living with endless doubt, wondering how they measured loyalty. If the choice never asked to be tested, I would never know. By the time the light began leaking through the blinds, my mind had stopped racing. I had committed to the path. The envelope stayed on the counter, untouched, and the ticket remained hidden where only I could find it. From here on, each conversation would reveal something I had been wondering for years. I made a single rule to keep my resolve steady. I wouldn't tell anyone about the lottery win until every person had given me an answer. Only then would I decide what to do with the secret I carried. With that fixed in my mind, all that remained was choosing who to face first. The first call I made was to my mother. She had always been the gentler voice in the family, the one I hoped would lean toward compassion when it mattered most. I rehearsed my words before I pressed dial, steadying my tone so it sounded genuine, not exaggerated. When she picked up, I explained the notice, the deadline, and my uncertainty about where to go. At first, there was silence. Then she said, "Are you sure you read it right? Maybe talk to your landlord again." Her voice carried worry, but soon it shifted toward her own burdens, car payments, dental work, rising bills. I knew then it wouldn't lead anywhere. When the call ended, I opened my notebook and wrote, "Mom, concerned, but no help." Next, I met my father in person, thinking maybe a face-to-face conversation would cut through his usual wall. We sat across from each other at a quiet diner, and I told him the same story. His response was swift. He leaned back, arms crossed, and told me, "You should have been saving. Life doesn't give handouts." His words landed like stones. No pause, no moment to consider my immediate need, just judgment dressed up as fatherly advice. By the time the check arrived, I already knew the outcome. In the notebook, his line was short: "Dad, lecture, no money." I turned then to my younger sister. She sounded sympathetic when she picked up, her voice warm enough to make me believe she might bend. She said softly, "That sounds so stressful. Maybe you could split a place with someone." For a moment, I thought she was circling toward an offer, but quickly came the reminder of her kids' expenses, school fees, braces, endless costs stacked against her own household budget. Her words trailed away before I even asked again. On the page, she became sister. Kind tone, but refused. My older brother answered last. I braced myself, knowing his instinct was always to undercut tension with jokes. And, as expected, he laughed. "Now you know how I live every month," he said. For a second, I thought maybe it was an attempt at bonding, but it turned fast into blame. He accused me of being careless, of not learning how to manage money, and added, "If anyone should be helped in this family, it's me." His laughter carried over mine as the call ended. By the time I took up the pen, the words almost wrote themselves. Brother. Joked, then turned it on me. When I looked down at the page, 4 lines summed up hours of talking and years of history, and still none of them ended with what I had asked for. All of their voices echoed in my head: concern without action, advice without aid, jokes without relief. Each response was different in delivery, but the same in result. No one gave what I needed. The hurt sharpened when the memories resurfaced. I thought back to a single night years earlier when my sister's rent had fallen short. She'd called me in tears, and even though I was down to spare change myself, I wired her $300 from my paycheck. I remembered scrolling my bank app after, wondering what bill I'd have to pay late. That single moment came crashing back now, a vivid reminder that my giving had never been met with equal measure. I sat staring at the neat rows of notes in my journal, the black ink looking heavier with each line. I realized it hadn't taken long at all for the test to expose what I had feared. It wasn't just one person or one weak excuse. It was a pattern, mirrored across 4 voices: concern masked as love, judgment disguised as wisdom, humor used as a wall. A cycle where my support for them had been visible, tangible, and theirs, for me, was absent. What caught me most off guard wasn't the disappointment itself. I had braced for that. It was how neatly each response landed inside the predictions I had scribbled the night before. Not one relative surprised me, and yet feeling the confirmation set in, a lived experience, instead of a possibility, pressed harder than I thought it would. I found myself gripping the edges of my notebook, staring at the lined paper until my sight blurred. The test was only just beginning, but already I felt as though the answers were decided. My chest tightened with the thought that maybe I'd been right all along. Family would only go so far, and only when it didn't mean a sacrifice of their own. It was then, as I set the notebook aside, that disbelief pooled heavier than sadness. Not one person had come close to offering even a fraction of tangible help, though none of them lacked the ability completely. The clarity I thought I wanted was beginning to feel like a wound I had pressed open myself. Still, I wasn't ready to quit. Somewhere deep inside, a sliver of hope kept me moving forward, telling me the story might not end here, and that thought was enough to push me toward the next name on my list. After the silence from my closest relatives, I felt drained, almost ready to abandon the test, but there was one name still unspoken: my mother's younger sister, Aunt Rosa. She wasn't someone I ever imagined turning to. Her life was lean, her health shaky, and she pushed herself at the grocery store well past the hours her body could afford. If anyone had a justifiable reason to say no, it was her. But the weight of everything pressed me forward, and I picked up the phone. It rang only twice before her voice came through, calm and unhurried. I recited the story I'd given the others, word for word, the eviction notice, and the $1,500. I braced myself for the pause, for the hesitation I had heard from everyone else. Instead, she broke in before I had even finished, asking how soon I needed it. My throat tightened. I hadn't expected that question. Then she said she would send $500 that night, and the rest when her paycheck cleared. As if that weren't enough, she added gently, "And if you can't stay there, you have my couch. You'll never be without a roof as long as I'm here." The words stunned me. There was no hesitation, no list of bills standing in her way, no lecture about responsibility. She had almost nothing, and still she moved instantly to cover me. In that small moment, I felt something crack open, shock, mixed with a relief I hadn't known I was still hoping for. I stared at her name in my notebook after the call. I had left it blank, unsure what to predict. Now I filled the line with trembling words. Helped. No hesitation. Offered home. I kept staring at those notes, realizing I was finally holding proof that loyalty didn't come from the people I expected, but from someone who had less to give and still gave anyway. Later that evening, I drove to see her. The duplex sat quiet under a weak yellow porch light. Inside, the smell of beans simmering drifted from the kitchen, and a slow-turning fan pushed the air from room to room. Rosa welcomed me with her easy smile, guiding me to a chair at her small table. She fussed about food before I could speak, pressing a chipped mug of coffee into my hands. Everything in the room, to the worn cushions, to the pile of neatly folded grocery coupons, spoke of a life without extras, but filled with care. When I repeated the situation, she didn't look away or shake her head. She opened a drawer and pulled out an envelope, sliding it across to me without explanation. Inside was $200 in cash, set aside from her last pay. "Just for now, until the transfer comes through," she said. I tried to object, knowing too well that her budget bent with every doctor's visit and rising bill. But her expression left no room for refusal. She pressed my hand and said, "Money shows people's hearts, mija." That moment anchored itself in me. She didn't need to explain further. The sentence hung in the air like a truth I had been circling all along. I folded the envelope, tucking it into my bag, and for the first time in days, my chest loosened. Driving home, her words replayed again and again. The contrast was impossible to ignore. My parents had turned to excuses. My siblings had hidden behind their obligations and laughter. Rosa, who had the smallest margin for error in her own life, had met me without hesitation and backed her promise with action. Not just words, not just gestures, 2 clear steps. Money now, a roof if I needed it. Pared down to its core, her loyalty took shape through small things that carried enormous meaning. By the time I sat alone in my apartment, both envelopes still pinned beneath the magnet on the fridge, the experiment felt different. It was no longer about who failed me. I had gathered that answer already. It was about who revealed themselves when I didn't expect it. Rosa had stood out, not for the size of her offer, but for the immediacy of it. The others had all paused before saying no. She had acted before I had finished asking. And that difference changed everything for me. The pattern of silence and excuses from my closest family members had left me questioning whether loyalty even existed in our bloodline at all. Rosa's act showed me it did, but it lived outside the circle I thought it would. Her life might not have measured up in wealth, but it carried a kind of abundance that no paycheck could equal. As I sat in the quiet, her voice lingered in my ears. Money shows people's hearts. For the first time since both those envelopes arrived, I felt the shape of certainty. I had seen what I came to see. What remained wasn't doubt. It was the next step, and deciding who deserved to hear the truth first. When I chose to share the truth with Rosa, it happened quietly in her kitchen. The radio hummed low from the counter, and the smell of beans simmering filled the small space. I had spent days rehearsing, trying to prepare the right words, but sitting across from her, this woman who had given without hesitation, it became simple. I said softly, "There's something I haven't told anyone. I'm not broke. I won the lottery. $18 million. For a moment, Rosa didn't move. Her eyes widened, her hand covering her mouth. She blinked several times, then whispered, asking if I was serious. When I nodded, her whole body seemed to release a breath she had been holding for years. The first thing she said was not about money. It was, "I'm so relieved you're safe now." Safe from fear. Safe from instability. She came around the table and wrapped me in her arms, her embrace expressing more than words. There was not a hint of envy or calculation. She never asked what she might receive. She only told me she was proud and that she wanted me to live free of worry. That quiet moment with her became the anchor I didn't know I needed. Her response made every silence and excuse from the rest of my family ring louder. Where they had withdrawn, she had stepped forward without pausing. That contrast made me face what I had been avoiding. Sooner or later, my secret would not stay hidden. And if the truth came through gossip or headlines, it would twist everything further. I needed to tell them directly, even if it stung. I decided on a family meeting. I rented a small private room at a local restaurant and called each of them, telling them it was important. The night of, I sat waiting as they filed in. The air was tense. My father's first words were, "What's this about?" My mother barely looked up from her phone. My siblings leaned toward each other, whispering, their expressions half curious, half defensive. Once everyone settled, I started slowly. I reminded them of the recent phone calls, of the way I had laid out my situation and asked for a specific amount. I described the silence, the excuses, and the deflections. I said it plainly. When I needed you, none of you helped. The words hung in the air like weight. Some shifted uncomfortably. Others immediately tried to explain, tossing out bad timing or insisting I hadn't sounded urgent enough. Their defenses felt hollow, circling around the one fact they couldn't erase. I let the room stay quiet for a moment after that. You could hear the clinking of silverware in the restaurant outside, but inside our small space, no one looked me in the eye. Only when their voices had trailed off into silence did I choose my moment. I pulled out folded papers from my bag and placed them on the table. "What I didn't tell you," I said evenly, "is that the same day I received the eviction notice, I also found out I had won the lottery." For a few seconds, no one moved. My brother laughed in disbelief until he saw the official confirmation of $18 million. My sister reached forward, gasping as though touching the paper would make it more real. My father stared hard, his skepticism dissolving instantly. A shift swept over the room, visible in their faces. Within moments, the conversation changed. Where days earlier I'd heard only refusals, now I was flooded with voices, talking over one another. My father leaned forward, telling me how I needed to be careful and that he could keep the money safe for me. My sister suggested plans about buying property together and going shopping. My brother hinted at business ventures. The same mouths that had been closed tight now spilled ideas, each word driven by curiosity over what they could share in. I sat back, listening, but their eagerness struck me as hollow. The sudden concern, the advice, the business talk, it was built on money, not loyalty. When I spoke again, my voice was steady. I won't be taking advice or making investments with any of you, I said. The only person I trust is Rosa. She gave what little she had when I had nothing, without hesitation. No one else did. The words brought silence sharper than anything before. My mother's face stiffened. My siblings looked away, exchanging glances they couldn't mask. My father tried to soften his tone, insisting he only wanted what was best. But I didn't waver. I repeated it clearly. Rosa had shown true loyalty, and that mattered more than anything they said now. As we left the restaurant, I could see irritation flicker beneath the surface of their expressions, annoyance, resentment, disbelief. But for the first time in my life, none of it carried power over me. I walked out of that private room differently. It wasn't the money that gave me strength. It was the certainty of knowing exactly where each of them stood. That evening left me with a new kind of clarity, one that would shape everything that followed. What had once felt uncertain was now fixed, and I knew the direction I would take from here. A year later, my life carried an entirely different shape, and every decision I made reflected the lessons I had been forced to learn. The daily panic of juggling bills was gone. No more thinning stacks of overdue letters, no more landlord at my door. Instead of flickering lights and thin walls, I lived in a modest house on the edge of town. It wasn't lavish, but it was steady, and that steadiness was what I had wanted more than anything. Yet, as the months passed, I realized stability alone wasn't the point. What mattered more was what I chose to build with it. The first promise I kept was to Rosa. She had stepped in with open hands when no one else had, and I wanted to make sure she never had to stretch herself that thin again. I covered her medical expenses, moved her prescriptions to a plan she wouldn't worry about, and convinced her to move into a small brick house near a park where she could walk each evening. I'll never forget her face the day she unlocked her new front door. Equal parts disbelieving and grateful. Watching her finally speak about future plans instead of constant worries felt like seeing her shoulders drop a burden she had carried for decades. She had given me her trust when she had so little to spare. Returning that security to her was the first choice that mattered. Once Rosa was settled, I looked outward. I made up my mind that the money would never become a mirror of ego or status. No cars that shouted wealth, no photos online reminding anyone of what I had. Instead, I funneled energy toward places that hit close to home. I started a quiet fund for renters who had faced the same kind of eviction notice I once held in my hands. At first, it was only me covering cases quietly, keeping tenants sheltered for another month. Then, a partnership with a local nonprofit gave the work structure. I never put my name on the program. I only asked for updates on families who avoided losing their homes. Each story reminded me of where I'd been, and how thin the line was between collapse and survival. Giving others breathing space felt far richer than counting balances in an account. My relationship with the rest of my family did not mend. The test a year before had already laid truths bare, and nothing since had shaken them. They noticed the new house, despite how quietly I had tried to live. My sister dropped mentions of her wealthy sister into conversations as though my situation somehow lifted her own standing. My brother circled back with endless ideas, disguised as business ventures, each attempt to tie himself to what I had. Their motives were transparent. Visits weren't about connection, only about proximity to something they wanted. Where Rosa showed loyalty without strings, they let money guide their attention. For a while, I felt a tug of guilt every time I kept distance, the old belief whispering that family had to mean something. But over time, clarity cut through that thought. Protecting myself wasn't greed. Choosing space wasn't selfishness. It was survival in a new form, protecting my peace instead of my bank balance. They claimed I had grown cold since winning, but the truth was simpler. Their actions closed the door, and I stopped pushing to open it again. With boundaries in place, I explored other ways to give that didn't drain me. Some gestures were simple: anonymous donations to pantries before the holidays, quiet transfers to keep families from slipping into debt. I didn't look for recognition. Protecting my privacy meant no one could guilt me into decisions or twist giving into obligation. For the first time, money was not leverage others held over me. It was a tool I could direct where I chose. What stayed with me most was how different life felt when measured not by things, but by time. I didn't buy luxury, but I claimed back quiet hours, waking without panic, cooking dinner without calculating what it cost, sitting across from Rosa in her garden as she described the flowers she had planted. Those moments gave me a steadiness that no display of wealth could replicate. Looking back across that year, I knew the lottery hadn't gifted me happiness. What it gave me was perspective. I saw who had turned from me when I was empty-handed, and I saw who had shown up when giving cost them more than they could spare. I used to bend myself to preserve bonds that existed only in name. Now I let them go. The money didn't teach me joy. It taught me honesty with myself, with my choices, with the people I gave space to. And in that honesty, there was a kind of wealth that reached further than any figure printed on a check, a wealth that revealed what truly matters once everything else is stripped away. In the end, what stood out was simple. When it came down to who showed up, only Rosa did. That truth reshaped how I see loyalty and forced me to set boundaries with everyone else. If you've ever felt taken for granted or used for your generosity, know you're not the only one. Sometimes facing that reality hurts, but it can also bring clarity about who deserves space in your life. Before you go, share in the comments one person who truly showed up for you, or a boundary you've chosen to keep. And if this story resonated, subscribe for more real stories about family, healing, and choice. Remember this: your worth is never defined by what others expect, but by the choices you make to protect it.